Institute. I am the acting director. My name's Kathleen Wilson. I'm from the history department. I'm beginning as full director in my own right, no longer acting. Even though I'm acting like a director, I'm not really the director, but I will become a real director on June 1st. Now what does this mean and why do you care? Well, what it means is we're starting a new sort of forum in Humanities Institute where we have themes and topics. Our first theme is going to be introduced by two of our colleagues, Lisa Dietrich and Victoria Hesford, and it is called QFT. QFT is Queer, Feminist, Trans Study. It's a topic of study that is an initiative of us, and they will be the acting directors and leaders of this next year, that is designed to create interdisciplinary conversations about gender and sexuality in transnational contexts. Rather than thinking about queer, feminist, trans as specific identity categories, like we have all been accustomed to do in the old identity politics, we're more interested in queer, feminist, trans as methods for enacting new kinds of subjects, analyses, aesthetics, politics, and worlds. We're especially interested in programming that will draw diverse audiences and create opportunities for exchange across difference, embracing difference and elaborating on what makes us all special and worthwhile as human beings. On Wednesday, November 5th, as part of this, Kate Bantigue-Fajardo, sorry, my Spanish is really bad, Associate Professor of American Studies and Asian American Studies at the University of Minnesota, and the author of Filipino Cross Currents, Oceanographies of Seafaring Masculinity and Globalization, will be speaking as part of this series. And future events will include a QFT Health and Race Symposium, a workshop on gender and religion, and a reading and study group. We also had a competition for the QFT logo, which was won by, who was it won by?
Brad Reyna.
Brad Reyna, which is very exciting. And, our topic for the following year will be Race and Empire After the Fall. I'm hoping to follow suit and have a good logo for that. And the third year of my directorship, I'm going to try to beat them. Well, you know, why don't I just say it out loud? And then the third year is up for grabs, and I would welcome conversations and suggestions for what our theme should be from the wider Stony Brook community. In fact, we welcome ideas not only from faculty and students at all levels, but also from the Long Island community. I think it's time to start putting ourselves on the map as something other than a suburb of New York. Now today we are very thrilled to be welcoming Heather Love, who's an outstanding and leading queer theorist of our generation, to Stony Brook. And here to introduce her will be Kaja Amin, an assistant professor of queer studies. Let me just say a couple words about Kaja. He has received his PhD in Romance Studies in French with the Graduate Certificate in Feminist Studies from Duke in 2009. His research and teaching interests include queer historiography and temporality, affect, literary modernism, transgender studies, and French cultural studies. He is widely published in all the expected suspect journals that we know, transgender studies, lesbian and gay studies, etc. His current book manuscript, Untimely Genet, seeks to amplify 20th century French author, playwright, and activist Jean Genet's untimely effects on queer contemporary studies. So here to introduce Heather is Kaja Amin.
So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Love. Professor Love is the R. Jean Brownlee Term Associate Professor and Associate Chair of English at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research interests include gender studies and queer theory, the literature and culture of modernity, affect studies, film and visual culture, psychoanalysis, race and ethnicity, sociology and literature, disability studies, and critical theory. She is the author of Feeling Backward, Loss and the Politics of Queer History, published by Harvard in 2007, and I always assign parts of this for my classes. The editor of a special issue of GLQ on the scholarship and legacy of Gail Rubin, and the co-editor of a special issue of New Literary History entitled Is There Life After Identity Politics? A book of her collected essays and lectures entitled Queer Affect Politics has just come out in Taiwan with Shenli Press as well. Professor Love's book, Feeling Backward, gave me my first work-through example of something that, until then, I had had a hard time envisioning. That is, what a full-scale work of what Eve Sedgwick terms reparative reading would actually look like. In Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading, or You're So Paranoid, You Probably Think This Essay Is About You, Sedgwick takes the monoculture of criticism to task for its outsized faith in the political power and efficacy of an analytics of exposure, its reification of a binary of power versus resistance, its preference for strong theories with great analytic reach and a corresponding reductiveness, and its aversion to surprise. Whereas queer studies as a whole, I think, responded to this essay by making queer synonymous with the alternative rather than the merely dominant or subversive, Professor Love's version of the reparative is more, shall we say, somber. In the introduction to Feeling Backward, Professor Love argues that the queer modernist texts that she studies do something quite consequential. They, quote, describe what it is like to bear a disqualified identity, which at times can simply mean living with injury, not fixing it. The book's most powerful methodological call to the queer critic, to describe without fixing, runs counter to the persistently affirmative and indeed redemptive impulse of most gay, lesbian, and yes, even queer scholarship on the past. Though this call to not fix may seem to reject the repair in reparative, I read it as reparative in the broader sense. Professor Love's 2010 essay, Truth and Consequences, on paranoid reading and reparative reading is typical of her approach insofar as it seeks to restore damage, aggression, and the risks of harm attendant upon every act of love to Sedgwick's practice of the reparative. Feeling Backward may exemplify such a broader reparative practice using quote-unquote weak methods of description rather than strong forms of diagnosis to consistently, and as I'm sure she would admit, aggressively, challenge queer theory's privileging of the most heroic modes of anti-normativity, in order to take the bad with the good, recognize when damage is just damage, and stubbornly, rigorously de-idealize. And as she reminds us in that essay on reparative reading, that's love too. This penchant for de-idealization as an ethical practice may be what ties Professor Love's earlier work to her current projects, some of which have nothing to do with affect and motivation, or that argue for methodologies that don't have anything to do with these things. And she has 3 of these new projects, one on reading methods in literary studies, one on the source materials of the sociologist Erving Goffman, and another on pedagogy, mentorship, and generations in queer studies. In a rousingly contrary talk I saw her give last year at the Thinking Feminism at the Limits colloquium at Columbia University, Professor Love scandalously accused queer theorists of having both methods and objects, and challenged us to articulate and avow them. This talk was refreshing in its de-idealization of queer studies' treasured image of itself as politically and intellectually radical, in its stance against its own institutionalization, refusal of repeatable, legitimating methods, and claims to have nothing so basely literal as a referent. Quietly puncturing queer studies' image of outsider glamour, Professor Love's talk pushed instead for an ethics of inhabiting our own institutionalization so that we might have an avowed investment in a queer futurity within the academy. I've been chewing on this provocation since then, and am thus all the more thrilled, as I hope you are too, to hear Professor Love's talk today on queer method and the post-war history of sexuality studies. So please join me.
Wow, guys, this is amazing. Do people want to come in, at least like sit on the stairs or something? I hate to have people outside the room. And come join me. It's good like that. We're just gonna, yeah. Honestly, people kind of sit up here, right? Yeah. Why don't you guys? Anybody who's not shy and looking good today, just come down. And yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for the invitation. Thanks everybody for coming. It's really an honor to be kind of kicking off this series and to be here at Stony Brook. Kaji, that was like the history of my life. That was incredible. It was like, it made so much sense of all of everything that I think about and have done. So thank you. I guess maybe just to pick up on something you were saying about my interest in queer method, and that is something that I see as a kind of interest in the series too. And yeah, I really have been trying to think about how to think more rigorously about the methods that queer studies actually does use and has used. And so in addition to giving this talk that you mentioned, I also have been teaching classes called Queer Method or Queer and Feminist Method, and I ran this conference last fall at University of Pennsylvania where I teach called Queer Method, which is basically about trying to recognize all the innovative methods that people have used in the field, but also to suggest the sort of non-innovative or kind of disciplinary methods that inform our work. And I think a recognition of that is important for quite a number of reasons. And so I hope this talk will give a sense of what my investments are. But I'm very happy to think about that as a kind of intellectual question that meshes with questions of pedagogy and institutionalization. So maybe we can kind of open up some of those questions more fully in the Q&A. Okay, so I'll just start. There have been many public discussions in recent years of whether the field of queer studies has run its course. The question tends to be discussed in one of two ways. One, is queer studies worth attending to after its canonical moment, when it was practiced by figures such as Judith Butler, Eve Sedgwick, Michael Warner, D.A. Miller. The story goes, now that the greatest generation of queer theorists is no longer providing leadership for the field, are we doomed to inferior, rote forms of scholarship, undertaken at a distance from activist ferment? Can we now only look back to a golden moment of scholarly and political transformation? I find this narrative deeply problematic in its hostility toward new disciplinary and activist formations, younger scholars, and the movement of the field into different geographic locations, different languages, and different institutional sites. Canonical U.S. queer theory saw itself as essentially anti-disciplinary, and many of its proponents, while often in prestigious institutional contexts themselves, have been critical of institutionalization. Or you might say they've been critical of other people's institutionalization. So I think it's important to recognize the institutional gains of queer studies in many different locations, and to see its uptake into everyday and unspectacular institutional and rhetorical forms as a gain. Here's another story about the end of queer studies. The field developed in the late 1980s was defined by its commitment to anti-normativity. The political strategies and styles that we know as queer emerged in the context of the AIDS epidemic and the sense of crisis that it produced. Queer studies reflects the new coalitions and tactics that emerged in that context. So queer was identified with the possibility of a movement based on a shared refusal of existing power structures and norms, rather than on a positive identification with any particular identity category. This non-identitarian version of queer studies, or what Michael Warner identified as the utopian universalism of queer politics, that's to say its desire to address the situation of all marginalized people, not just gender and sexual minorities, has been the subject of intense critique from the start. Many feminist, lesbian, and gay activists and scholars resented queer's ambition as a master term of politics, and the fact that it defined its project against the regimes of the normal, which tended to include the identity-based politics and knowledge production that had fed work on sexuality and gender up to that point. Furthermore, it became clear early on that the field's ambition to constitute, in Douglas Crimp's words, a collectivity of the shamed under the name of queer excluded lots of people, and that the field was better at addressing sexual stigma rather than, in Eve Sedgwick's words, the quote, fractal intricacies of language, skin, migration, state. While queer was often critiqued for its exclusions, and still is, for many now, observing the energy and successes of a rights-based approach, this focus on anti-normativity, marginality, and exclusion can seem simply out of date. So probably typically for me, you've got a little account of feeling backward here. At a moment when many people are thinking about the end of queer studies, I find myself thinking about its past, particularly its disregarded past, its disregarded histories. So I think there is some interest these days in the prehistory of queer, different prehistories of queer, For instance, you can think about the taking up of black feminist theory in politics as foundational for contemporary queer color critique, or we can think about popular and academic interest in lesbian and lesbian feminist writing and ways of life among younger queer, trans, and lesbian-identified people. And in general, I think there's an interest in the continuity between earlier iterations of gay liberationist, lesbian feminist, and transsexual activism, and contemporary queer, genderqueer, and trans activism today. So I think there is a kind of interest in these kind of prehistories. My own work, and what I'm going to be talking about today, is about a different prehistory, and that is one that finds its roots in post-war research in the social sciences. Sexuality studies scholars in the social sciences have been insisting for a long time that the foundational role of empirical research by historians, anthropologists, and sociologists in making the field of queer studies has been ignored. So these scholars argue that contemporary queer studies is overly identified with the fields of literary studies, psychoanalysis, philosophy, and critical theory. They argue that it was post-war social science research that allowed for a shift in understanding sexuality, or homosexuality really, not as an individual pathology or illness or a mental illness, but rather to see it as a social formation. So, and also they critique contemporary queer studies for emphasizing discourse, representation, language, psychic structures, and not paying enough attention to questions of materiality, social practice, and institutions. So I was actually trained in that humanities version, psychoanalysis, literary theory, philosophy, and so on. Which is what these social scientists are critiquing. And this is the kind of canonical version of queer theory that emerged around 1990 with the publication of Gender Trouble, Epistemology of the Closet, and so on. So that's my training, but despite that fact, I myself have been struck by the extent to which queer scholars in the humanities have simply ignored that work and those critiques, confident in their critical account of the ethics and epistemology of empirical research. So this is a critique that's been going on for a long time and basically hasn't really been heeded, I think, by a lot of scholars in the humanities. So my perspective has started to shift, and this is partly an account of that shift or showing the results of that shift. And part of that does come out of this long collaboration I've had with the anthropologist and queer scholar Gail Rubin, who has long been arguing for the kind of the fact that this very important scholarship has typically been ignored. So working with her kind of changed my perspective, but also I simply became interested in these materials, partly because I became really obsessed with this one particular sociologist, the post-war Canadian-American sociologist Erving Goffman, and in particular his 1963 book, Stigma, Notes on the Management of Spoiled Identity. So one of the book projects that Kadi mentioned is a book that's entirely about this book. So I've really been thinking about him, okay? And today what I want to do is to think about Goffman, and this is a kind of, for people who are familiar at all with Goffman's work, this may seem a bit perverse, to think about Goffman as a kind of founding figure for sexuality studies, okay? Not Goffman, not queer, okay? Didn't work on queer materials, did not address sexuality at length in his work, but he does treat homosexuality as one of the general forms of difference in stigma, okay? So homosexuality is in this book. It's in there along with physical and mental disability, addiction, racial difference, being in prison or having been in prison, homelessness, being an immigrant, being Jewish, being a circus worker, being a con man, being an intellectual, being a jazz musician, or being a juvenile delinquent. Okay, so this is basically the archive of mid-century deviant studies, okay, the field of deviant studies, all right? And so Goffman treated non-normative sexuality as merely one example of the kind of disadvantaged traits that are stigmatized. And this kind of cast of characters is familiar from this mid-century field, all right? So deviant studies, as you might guess from its name, is often dismissed by progressive critics for its flattening, objectifying account of the deviant populations that gather in the shadows of the city. So the field, while often good at describing the particular conditions of marginal groups, was premised on a naturalized and permanent understanding of social hierarchy. And so for this reason, the decline of deviant studies, very, very important in the 50s, 60s, its decline in the late 60s and in the 1970s is often linked to the rise of the civil rights movement, i.e., deviant populations are not deviant for good. These groups can actually rise up and change the conditions by which they are judged deviant, okay? And an important article on this is called Coming Out All Over, Deviance in the Politics of Social Problem Research by John Kitsuse, which he wrote in 1980, which makes that argument. I actually want to make an argument for the importance of deviant studies despite its problems and with its problems in view, and to argue that it is quite relevant to contemporary sexuality studies or contemporary queer studies. And the basis on which I want to make this argument is that deviant studies basically is queer studies. That's to say, queer studies is a form of deviant studies. So let me explain what I mean by that. So deviant studies, rather than embracing the kind of cause of any particular deviant population, is interested in a kind of universal category of the stigmatized, or often the outsider or the underdog, okay? In a sense, I think this kind of generalized category of the social outsider is a model of social exclusion that resurfaces in key moments in the history of sexuality studies. So we can trace this back to work in Chicago School of Sociology, a kind of urban ecology model from the first part of the 20th century, and then to deviant studies, or classic deviant studies, in the work of people like Goffman, Howard Becker, Simon and Gagnon. It comes up in a very important moment in more recent sexuality studies, and this is a bit of nerdy fandom that I'm going to do right now. But, for those of you who know Gail Rubin's essay, Thinking Sex, she does this great diagram called the charm circle, which is about acceptable sexualities in the middle and the outer limits or unacceptable sexualities on the outside. She actually presented this for the first time at the Barnard, famous kind of site at the Sex Wars, the Barnard Conference on Sexuality, this conference in 1982, and this is the handout that she did of that. So this turns up in print form in that essay, but this is the sort of early version of it. But we do, I think, have a kind of deviant studies model here of what's acceptable, what's normal, and then lots of different things are sort of find themselves on the outer limit, right? It's a kind of general category of sexually stigmatized populations, okay? So here it is again. This is the model, I think, that underwrites Michael Warner's canonical model of queer revolt against what he calls the regimes of the normal in his introduction to Fear of a Queer Planet. Okay, so it's everybody who's outside the normal. And it's there in an important critique of queer studies from 1997 by Kathy Cohen. Kathy Cohen, in this essay that I want to draw attention to, makes a critique of what she calls the false universalism of queer studies, its claim to speak for everyone, while in fact speaking more for gender and sexual minorities. And what she calls for is a renewal of queer politics that would make good on its promise of a non-identitarian, anti-normative politics that would focus on how power structures the sexual field. And so that essay by Kathy Cohen, which I find very important, is called Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens. And in a sense, I think this is a moment where Kathy Cohen is kind of using a deviant studies model. That's to say, thinking about social power in relation not to major axes of identity, race, class, and gender, although they're in there, but rather through these highly particular figures, right? So instead of the sort of classic figures of deviant studies, the marijuana user, the juvenile delinquent, the ex-mental patient, the stutterer, Cohen, right? These are the stigmatized. Cohen gives us punks, bulldaggers, and welfare queens, okay? So these are highly particular figures. We can read power in them, but they're not, we don't have categories, we have figures. And I think thinking about queer studies as the long history of deviant studies can help us to reframe other major work in the field. I'm thinking about the work of Michel Foucault, allowing us to see him in the context of post-war critiques of institutions and of psychiatry, I think it can also help us to make sense of Foucault's focus on highly particular figures. In Foucault's case, the masturbating child, the hysterical woman, the pervert, and the Malthusian couple, right? So it's this kind of deviant studies model that keeps recurring. All right, so Goffman's work on stigma, I think, is valuable because of the way it absorbs and uses this deviant studies approach. And actually, Goffman was teaching at UC Berkeley in the early 60s, and in 1961 he was asked to teach their deviant studies course, like for the sociology department, which he did reluctantly, and it was out of that experience of teaching that he wrote Stigma, which you already saw. And so the Stigma is basically an account of a set of highly particular figures who are stigmatized in very different ways, and the strategies that they use to resist or to manage that stigma. Okay, and so this is interesting to me, and this is part of what makes him a kind of precursor for queer studies. But what I'm also interested in about Goffman, and what I want to draw attention to today, is his relation not just to deviant studies, but to another important kind of strand of sociological research, and that is microsociology. Okay, the sort of analysis of face-to-face interactions and small social worlds. All right. So in work on social interaction and communication, Goffman focused consistently on social dynamics at the micro scale. He tended to sidestep questions of social structure and history, and he didn't have much to say about psychological interiority either. Goffman didn't write about capital, race, or class, except insofar as they are materialized in visible behavior, in gesture, spacing, tone of voice, eye contact, clothing, and comportment. So I see Goffman in this work as drawing on a natural history approach adopted by many scholars in the period. Often drawing directly on practices of animal observation, this research was distinguished by several key features. An interest in interaction at a small scale, so again, sort of face-to-face interaction, an emphasis on observable behavior, what can be sort of seen by a human observer, systems thinking, ecology, and attention to dynamic context, work in the field rather than in the laboratory. Let's say go to the social scene that you want to see and look at it there. And what I think particularly interests me today and what I want to focus on is a reluctance to speculate about the interior life of your research subjects. All right, so if deviant studies has a bad reputation today, I think observational approaches also are not in great shape either, for instance, in the field of queer studies. Literary scholars, for instance, have tended to write off empirical methods altogether, both on epistemological and ethical grounds. On epistemological grounds, objectivity, description, observation aren't really possible, there's only interpretation, and on ethical grounds, objectivity is objectifying of social others. Human activity should not be observed and treated as behavior because it's always symbolic activity. Okay? So I want to make what's going to strike some people as a counterintuitive argument for the ethical value of observational methods. I want to suggest that the flattening observational forms of analysis these researchers, these microsociological researchers employed, were not necessarily dehumanizing. Instead, I want to argue that their strict adherence to techniques of observation and description meant that they were less likely to speculate about who their research subjects truly were or what they truly felt. Instead, they offered detailed accounts of their practices. I see this descriptive method as in line with a queer tradition of resistance to surveillance, interest in flatness and surfaces, and avoiding interiority. And that clearly comes out of a kind of history of the treatment of homosexuality in therapeutic context, right? To actually be able to resist a kind of psychological or psychoanalytic gaze is quite important, okay? Microanalytic research protocols, I want to suggest, were, on account of their refusal to speculate about interiority, destigmatizing, not objectifying, or you might even say they were destigmatizing insofar as they were objectifying. All right, so my interest in Goffman is, as a figure for queer studies, is in Goffman's method. All right, and so how I want to describe that is that he combines the protocols of deviant studies with those of observational microsociology. He draws attention to the plight of highly specific marginal figures, but thins out his description of them through an observational approach. As a result, he tends to give a detailed account of the operations of stigma without reinforcing it or redoubling it. Okay, so that's sort of why I'm interested in Goffman, and now I want to talk more concretely about his actual relations to the history of sexuality studies. So I'm going to get more, that's more theoretical, this is more concrete, and to think about what the gains for contemporary queer studies might be of a closer encounter with Goffman's method. All right, so there's sort of two cases here, all right? The first one is about a kind of missed connection between Goffman and sexuality studies, and the second one is about a closer inheritance of his method. All right, so I'm going to talk about the missed encounter first. All right, so here I want to talk about the way that one important concept in Goffman, and that's his concept of the self as a kind of dramaturgical category, right? The self as a kind of actor on the stage, which he elaborated in this book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, how this concept of the dramaturgical concept of the self was not taken up in queer studies, especially in one of the key features of queer studies, the theory of gender performativity. All right. So I want to look at this moment of the sort of failure to take up Goffman as a specific loss for queer studies, but also as an example of what I was describing as this broader dismissal of social science antecedents for the field. All right. So I'm thinking about, as probably no surprise here to many of you, I'm thinking about Judith Butler's Gender Trouble from 1990, which offers a theory of the performativity of gender, but actually makes no mention of the performance or presentation of self in everyday life by Goffman. Goffman doesn't appear in Gender Trouble, all right? And I have to say this is a big oversight. Butler actually does address Goffman's work in an earlier essay, and this is an essay from 1988 called Performative Acts and Gender Constitution, an essay in phenomenology and feminist theory. And that came out in, I think it's interesting that it came out in Theater Journal, which actually was kind of, and she was more engaged with social science and theater studies in that context, okay? But these are fields that she downplayed as she came to her own kind of discursive linguistic theory of performativity, all right? So Butler, in that essay, holds up Goffman's dramaturgical account of the self as an example of the pitfalls of the concept of theatricality and what she sees as the expressive account of gender that follows from it. So she argues that gender should not be understood as a role, quote, as a role which either expresses or disguises an interior self. Instead, she writes, gender constructs the social fiction of its own psychological interiority. According to Butler, Goffman's account of social life depends on a stable interior self that acts in and on the world. And she argues that such a view, basically kind of rational actor theory like in economics, she argues that such a view underestimates the power of norms, particularly of linguistic norms, and aggrandizes individual agency. So this is Butler writing about Goffman in this 1988 essay. As opposed to a view such as Erving Goffman's, which posits a self which assumes and exchanges various roles within the complex social expectations of the game of modern life, I am suggesting that this self is not only irretrievably outside, constituted in social discourse, but that the ascription of interiority is itself a publicly regulated and sanctioned form of essence fabrication. So Butler argues that Goffman assumes a pre-existing gendered self that takes up and discards social roles at will. At the same time, by subscribing through this stable notion of the self, Goffman actually, in her view, further stabilizes gender, implicitly participating in what she calls a social policy of gender regulation and control. So by missing the radical potential of gender performativity, as distinguished from the simple performance of gender, Butler argues that Goffman contributes to the perpetuation of the status quo. So it's both kind of methodologically unsound and conservative. Okay? I think this is a radical misreading of Goffman's account of the self, really, Goffman does not have a substantial theory of the self. In fact, the self for Goffman is thoroughly constituted in and by social interaction. The refusal of the self as an expressive or authentic core, I mean, it's almost like the only thing that Goffman says in any of his work, right? It's a kind of repeated claim, okay? But it's also the basis for his method, as he makes clear in the introduction to the 1967 collection, Interaction Ritual. I always like to joke that, like, does it look like there's an authentic self in here? No, obviously not. It's totally crazy in there. Okay, all right. So you got what Butler's account of Goffman is. I'm just going to have you compare that to what I think Goffman actually thinks about the self. All right, by looking at this quote. I assume the proper study of interaction is not the individual and his psychology, but rather the syntactical relations among the acts of different persons mutually present to one another. Nonetheless, since it is individual actors who contribute the ultimate materials, it will always be reasonable to ask what general properties they must have if this sort of contribution is to be expected of them. What minimal model of the actor is needed if we are to wind him up, stick him in amongst his fellows, and have an orderly traffic in behavior emerge? What minimal model is required if the student is to anticipate the lines along which an individual, qua interactant, can be effective or break down? That is what these papers are about. A psychology is necessarily involved, but one stripped and cramped to suit the sociological study of conversation, track meets, banquets, jury trials, and street loitering. Not then men and their moments, rather moments and their men. Okay, so Goffman, far from ascribing interiority, as Butler would argue, dismisses psychological accounts of the subject. He sees individuals as implicated in social games, but by prioritizing the rules of those games, those syntactical relations, rather than the desires of those who play them, he undermines rather than amplifies individual agency. Goffman strikes a note of resignation when he explains that since actors contribute materials to social situations, some minimal notion of the self is needed in order to account for interactions. The self, for Goffman, is then a methodological necessity, more like a game piece or a stick figure than a fleshed out psychological self. By identifying the goal of such specification as an orderly traffic in behavior, Goffman makes clear that one of the key social frames for the behavior of these actors is the context of his own study of them. So the key elements of Butler's theory, much more familiar to us today, her suggestion that selves are radically ungrounded and thoroughly constituted by social norms, that identity is constituted in time, her account of the, quote, mundane way in which bodily gestures, movements, and enactments of various kinds constitute the illusion of an abiding gendered self, Butler, are suggested strongly, both in Goffman's account of the self and role and in his own work on gender, particularly in gender advertisements. Goffman sees identity as constituted in time through the repetition of gestures and social acts, and in the mundane social performances that make, for instance, gender roles appear as essence. Goffman, I want to argue, offers an ecological view of the self that places it in dynamic context, understanding individual behavior to be situated not only in time, but also in space. And his attention to concrete social interaction and to particular social spaces does not preclude attention to language and textuality, as is suggested by his reference to the syntax of social interaction, as well as the reflexivity of his account of individual agency, if we are to wind him up. So Butler's misreading of Goffman, I think, can and probably should be read as a predictable moment of strategic misreading in the context of the launching of her own theory. Yeah, of course. But I think it's also important, it's more important to see it as a misconnection, okay? A misconnection between a socially grounded account of performance and a linguistically oriented account of performativity. And that split is one that we are still living with today. We're living with the consequences of a split between descriptive accounts of social action on the one hand and anti-foundational linguistic accounts of performativity on the other, living the split between accounts of the self and accounts of the subject. All right? So Goffman drops out of gender trouble entirely and is rarely mentioned in contemporary discussions of gender performativity. But Goffman was taken up, and here's not the misconnection, but the close encounter. Goffman was taken up in some foundational, if now not that much read, texts in sexuality studies. Okay, so Goffman was extremely influential with this book, Esther Newton's Mother Camp from 1972, Female Impersonators in America. And this is a book that Butler does use quite a bit in building her account of drag, which is crucial to her account of gender performativity. And in fact, I saw Esther Newton recently say that Goffman was the most important critic to her of all time. So there's a real connection there that I think hasn't really been acknowledged. But another text that is very indebted to Goffman, explicitly so, is this book by Laud Humphreys, published in 1970, called Tearoom Trade, Impersonal Sex in Public Places. So both of these texts, I think, are very important in the history of sexuality studies, more important than they've been recognized to be. And I think they both cite Goffman explicitly, and I think they both show the promise of his method. Again, what I described as a kind of combining of deviant studies with a microsociological or natural history approach, and in ways that I think can be really instructive for us today. So I'm going to focus on, the rest of the talk is basically a kind of exploration of this text as a kind of Goffmanian, an example of Goffmanian sexuality studies. All right. Okay, so this text was was published, I guess, as a dissertation in 1968, and then as a book in 1970. And it's really a classic account of this interactionist microsociology that I've been describing. So working as a participant observer, Humphreys meticulously mapped the operations, gestures, glances, and sexual acts of men having sex in public restrooms in the 1960s. That's why everybody's laughing about the participant observation thing. Okay. So this is an important case study in method, actually, partly because it was the subject of an extended public controversy about research ethics, working with human subjects. And one of the interesting things about the book is that it's curiously divided into two quite different parts. Okay. So the first part is an example of what I wanted to describe as this kind of minimalist, descriptive account of visible behavior. All right. The kind of interactionist microsociology that I've been describing, and that's the Goffmanian part, in my view. The second part of the book features biographical and psychological profiling through the uses of interviews and surveys. So it's really the first part that exemplifies the key aspects of Goffman's method, how we might account for concrete social differences in power without recourse to a deep account of the self. Then the second part comes in and gives us that deep account of the self, and that's really a counterexample for me. So I'm going to talk about that a bit more, but just to kind of give you an overview. All right, so the anonymity and impersonality desired by the men in the tea rooms, the bathrooms where they're having sex, is reflected in Humphreys' observational methodology. Tearoom Trade opens in a discursive dry register, apparently at odds with the explicit erotic material that Humphreys discusses in the course of his account of, quote, sexual encounters without involvement. Through the early sections of the book, Humphreys offers what he refers to as an ecological account of the interaction of men in search of kicks in anonymous tea room settings. So before Humphreys became a sociologist, went to sociology grad school, he was a pastor, all right? And he cites this as the reason that he's not shocked by what he's seeing in the tea rooms, okay? But, he says, for his work in Tea Room Trade, he began to, quote, listen to sexual deviance with a scientist rather than a pastor's ear. Tea room participants are treated, at least for most of the text, as interactants, players in a game that is rule-bound and that unfolds in a delimited space and time. Drawing on Goffman's understanding of the interaction membrane, Humphreys details how individuals are drawn into play, how interactions are initiated, what its phases are, and what constitute closing moves. His account of these interactions, which actually come with these really handy schematic diagrams. So this is before anything starts to happen. This just gives you a sense of where the urinals are, if there's doors on the stalls, where you can look out and see if the police are coming, all these kinds of questions. So basically, his account of these interactions, right, with these schematic diagrams, might easily be taken for records of chess matches, were it not for the fact that they are intermittently punctuated with mentions of fellatio and handplay. There is no mention in these accounts of the biographies or internal fantasy lives of the actors. What is of concern is their mere visible appearance and their moves in a game. When discussing these interactions, Humphreys repeatedly puts the word private into scare quotes. And in fact, people are backgrounded in this account. What matters is really the shared social space and the unfolding events that it allows. This ecological understanding of the space is reflected in the participants' own understanding. I have noted more than once, Humphreys writes, that these men seem to acquire stronger sentimental attachments to the buildings in which they meet for sex than to the persons with whom they engage in it. According to Humphreys, there are two important methodological gains in his choice of the tea room as subject. He writes, "These facilities constitute a major part of the free sex market for those in the homosexual subculture, and for millions who might never identify with the gay society. For the social scientists, these public toilets provide a means for direct observation of the dynamics of sexual encounters in situ. Moreover, they facilitate the gathering of a representative sample of secret deviants, for most of whom association with the deviant subculture is minimal." This account of the benefits for the social scientist of the tea room example recapitulates the central division in the book between naturalistic observation of interaction in the field and the study of the lives of secret deviants. Okay, so Humphreys gathered his data for this kind of observational account by being in the tea rooms, okay, and undertaking silent observation in situ or in the field. And he was posing as what he calls a watch queen, i.e. Somebody who is there to look out and see if the police are coming, but is also a voyeur of what's going on in the tea rooms. And he has a chapter about the social scientist as voyeur, which reflects on that. Okay, so that was what he did, and then he did this other thing, which is that he wrote down the license plate numbers of the cars outside of the bathroom. He went and traced them in police registries and got people's addresses, and then he was doing a totally other survey, like a public health survey, and though he went to their houses and interviewed them in their homes. This is not cool, okay? And this is not what I'm recommending as like a great queer method. And this is in fact why, putting these guys at risk and completely violating their privacy, lying, and so on. This is not what I'm advocating, but and this is why it's often that a lot of reform around human subject research happened because of this bad example. All right. Okay, but while one might argue that neither Humphreys' research in situ, that's to say as a watch queen in the tea rooms, nor these follow-up interviews, neither was consensual, the interviews with these men in their homes were gathered under false pretenses, right? And were much more invasive, I want to argue, than the observation of these supposedly private but in fact impersonal sex acts. Okay. All right, in a 2005 article arguing for the value of thin description, Wayne Breckus, John Gallagher, and Jabir Gubriam, these three sociologists, consider Humphreys' naturalist work in Tea Room Trade. And so they write, the hallmark of naturalistic work is the presentation of richly scenic data, not exclusively the frequency, distribution, and pattern relationships evident in research materials. So they're arguing for this kind of thin description or this sort of observational approach, and they're distinguishing it both from a kind of more richly narrative or psychological account and from quantitative work. Okay, so Tea Room Trade presents Humphreys as a naturalist. It takes